This is Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Here we go. The Tehran Conference was in November of 1943. The main agreements were that Britain and the USA agreed to open up a second front by invading France. The Soviet Union was to wage war against Japan once Germany was defeated. The UN would be set up after the war, and an area of eastern Poland was to be added to the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted to change the borders of Poland to be along the Oder and Neisse rivers? I don't know. But the strains with the second front, Stalin was annoyed that Britain and France delayed opening a second front. Stalin was convinced that the British and Americans were waiting until the Soviet Union had been seriously damaged by the German invaders. Churchill also really didn't like Stalin because he was convinced that Soviet troops would remain in countries they liberated from the Germans. Britain had gone to war in September of 1939 to maintain the independence of Poland. However, Stalin believed that Soviet control of Poland was essential to prevent future invasions. Okay, after Tehran was the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, just before the war ended in May of 1945, because everything good happens in May. They agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan once Germany had surrendered, to divide Germany into 4 zones, US, British, French and Soviet, to divide Berlin into 4 zones in the same way, to hunt down and try Nazi war criminals in an international court of justice, to allow countries that had been liberated from occupation by the German army to have free elections to choose the new government they wanted, to join the new United Nations organization in order to maintain peace once the war ended, and that Eastern Europe would be a Soviet sphere of influence. They disagreed on how much Germany was to pay in reparations. Stalin wanted a much higher figure than either Roosevelt or Churchill. The decision was delayed until the next conference. They also disagreed about Poland. Stalin wanted the Polish-German border to be much further to the west than the Western Allies. He also wanted a friendly Polish government so that his country would have some protection from Germany. The Western powers feared that this would be a Soviet-controlled government. They persuaded Stalin to agree to allow free elections in Poland. Potsdam in July 1945. They agreed to divide Germany and Berlin as previously agreed. Each of the 4 zones of Germany and 4 sectors of Berlin were occupied and administered by one of the Allies. To demilitarize Germany. To re-establish democracy in Germany, including free elections, a free press, and freedom of speech. That Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies in equipment and materials. Most of this would go to the Soviet Union, which had suffered most. The Soviet Union would be given a quarter of the industrial goods made in the Western zones in return for food and coal from the Soviet zone. To ban the Nazi Party. Nazis were removed from important positions and leading Nazis were put on trial for war crimes at Nuremberg in 1946. That Poland's frontier was to be moved westwards to the rivers Oder and Neisse. To participate fully in the United Nations organization. They disagreed over what to do about Germany. 20 million Russians had died during the war, and Stalin wanted massive compensation that would have totally and permanently crippled Germany. Truman refused. He saw a revived Germany as a possible barrier to future Soviet expansion. Stalin wanted to disable Germany completely to protect the Soviet Union against future threats. Truman did not want Germany to be punished in the way it had been by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Truman wanted free elections in the countries of Eastern Europe occupied by Soviet troops. Stalin refused to submit to US pressure, believing it was unwelcome interference. Truman was furious and began a get-tough policy against the Soviet Union, the Iron Fist approach. But changes between Yalta and Potsdam. Soviet troops liberated countries in Eastern Europe but did not remove their military presence. By July, they occupied Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Stalin had set up a communist government in Poland, ignoring the wishes of the majority of the Poles and the agreements made at Yalta. Stalin ignored protests from Britain and the USA. He insisted that his control of Eastern Europe was a defensive measure against possible future attacks. The Red Army was the biggest in the world, but Stalin refused to cut down his armed forces after the war. Whilst there was demilitarization in the West, the Soviet Union continued to expand its armed forces.